Kübra Gümüşay, author of the bestseller Sprache und Sein and also an activist, will now give you a concise idea of what a constructive debating culture is. She observed such a culture during the first few weeks of the global pandemic, and she argues to keep this spirit for future debates. Please enjoy the Firework of Ideas keynote by Kübra Gümüşay.
I would like to talk to you about constructive dialogue and discourse. Within the first few days and weeks of the global pandemic, we have witnessed something very unique and unprecedented, I would say. We have experienced constructive dialogue. Members and representatives from political institutions, from the fields of economic, arts and culture, education and healthcare, and various fields that shape and form our society were stepping into the unknown and were asking questions themselves. What can we do? How can we contribute to preventing this global pandemic from further spreading? They were all willing to chip in. They were all willing to change and transform their institutions, their structures, to ensure public safety and do things that would have been deemed radical just a few days ago, if not a day ago. And that to me was unique, because seeing all these people asking questions such as, I don't know, but maybe would you think that this would be helpful? Contributing, listening to one another, questioning themselves and others, willing to do mistakes, and also declaring a very unique and universal truth, and that is that we were stepping into the unknown. But while they were saying this, I was wondering, haven't we always been stepping into the unknown? Because the future is not clear. It has never been clear. It is always a consequence of our actions that we do today. But we can't ever fully ensure that we know all of the detailed consequences of our actions. So that witnessing this kind of more humble approach to governing, forming and reigning, that humble approach to a discourse, to me was unique and a very big learning experience. And I wondered, how can we transport this kind of culture and cultivate it in the future as well? How can we ensure that in our future we will still be able to create spaces of public thinking, where our civil society can witness how people in power are willing to learn, how they're willing to try and do mistakes and learn from them and grow, rather than what we've experienced in the past, just declaring truths, absolute truths, competing with one another and trying to gain the attention of the audience and win each other over. Where we rarely saw people willing to listen to people who have a different opinion, who oppose them. And then I wondered, what if we use that kind of public discourse when discussing racism, sexism, or climate change? What if we cultivated this kind of public discourse to tackle societal problems that are not limited to one institution, that are not the problem of just one individual group, but are problems that affect us all, and we can only change them together? We need this public thinking and constructive discourse to be able to think about a future, a progressive future, because none of us know actually what a progressive future looks like. We don't know what a future looks like that is free of racism and sexism and poverty and all of the things that strip people away from a dignified life. To be able to think about this future, to be able to reach this future, we need spaces of public constructive discourse in which we can contribute and do mistakes and learn from one another. To cultivate a constructive dialogue in the future, we need two things. Number one, we need to create an understanding of how limited our knowledge and perspective is. That we don't know the full truth, but we have an understanding of our perspective, and we are in need of other perspectives to then create a great understanding of the problem that we're dealing with. So us understanding our limits will ensure us being curious about other perspectives and puzzling them together to be able to understand the problem we're dealing with. This also means that anyone who claims to know the truth and declares absolute ideologies and truths will be excluded from that kind of discourse. And that is what we need. We don't need to reward people for claiming to know it all and have seen it all, but we should rather reward people who have some form of understanding of the expertise, but also the limits of the expertise, who have some form of consciousness about their responsibility in dealing with their knowledge and their expertise, and are willing to learn from others, to bring knowledge together and engage in a public discourse. Number 2, we need to cultivate a culture that enables failure. When someone does a mistake, that person hasn't failed. But we have all won, we have all gained more knowledge, more insights. Without mistakes, we wouldn't be able to step into the unknown, gain innovative thoughts, gain innovative and new insights, and understand where we're heading to. Science wouldn't work without scientists making thousands and millions of mistakes. No experiment would be enabled or possible if they weren't allowed to do mistakes. So we need to cultivate that. And the global pandemic has shown us constructive discourses are what allows us to come together, to think about the challenges we have as societies, bring forces together, bring knowledge together to create true solutions. We need to learn this, keep this, and transport it into our future to be able to govern in a progressive and holistic way.
Marc Saxer, author and head of Asia Department at Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, will give to you a 7-minute keynote about the question of who pays the costs of the current crisis. Austerity or no austerity? That is the question, he argues. Additionally, Marc says that it's good to have strong narratives. However, they must be broken down into concrete, visible projects. Hear it yourself.
Over these past weeks, we hear lots of hope from progressives that the coronavirus crisis will change things for the better. There's a lot of talk about solidarity, deceleration of life, better pay for essential workers, and maybe even the nationalization of the healthcare systems. The question is any of this realistic? And here we need to heed the warning of the 2008 financial crisis. Back then, it was also said that neoliberalism is dead. Well, what happened is that the cost of the crisis was socialized while the wins remained with the rich. As a result, the lower third of the population paid the cost of the crisis, while the concentration of wealth and power at the top accelerated. Is it going to be different this time? What we know already is Europe alone spent to the tune of 4 trillion euros in order to mitigate the fallout from the corona crisis. And we know that we need to consolidate state finances or another euro crisis is upon us. What we don't know yet is how this can be done. Make no mistake, neoliberals are already gearing up for the next round of austerity. So this struggle over who has to pay for the costs of the crisis is the most important political struggle of our time. What is at stake here? First, we should be under no illusion that another round of austerity in Southern Europe could be implemented through democratic means. Another decade of austerity will most likely mean the end of liberal democracy in some countries, and it could really rip apart the European Union. Second, in the iron cage of austerity, it will not be possible to make the massive investments we need to mitigate climate change. And third, without the long-term massive investment of the state, our real economies will not recover with all the consequences for the weakest in our societies. So in sum, the fight against austerity may not be everything, but without it, everything progressives hold dear is lost. So, are progressives prepared for this battle of all battles? Let's have a reality check in the three categories needed to make transformative change: narratives, alliances, and projects. When it comes to narratives, there has been considerable progress since 2008. It is widely accepted that a progressive project needs some sort of a utopian vision. Some narratives, like the Green New Deal or Just Transition, have actually gained some traction. What we need to do now is to develop more of these. Are these narratives helpful in our mission of bringing together broad societal alliances? Definitely yes. But are these alliances capable of mobilizing the power resources needed to break through the resistance of the status quo alliance? I doubt so. Let's have a deeper look at the attempts progressives make to build alliances. I basically see three right now. The social democratic alliance between workers and the enlightened middle classes is falling apart. The intersectional alliance between emancipatory minority struggles is helpful when it brings together different protest movements, but as an electoral strategy, it has fallen flat so far. Finally, the left populist alliance between the 99% against the 1% had some traction in southern Europe, but none in the north. Hence, we need to go back to the drawing board and revisit our strategies of alliance building. Let's start with a basic question. What is the function of a narrative? A narrative is the platform around which groups with differing interests and identities can come together to form an alliance. In other words, a strategic narrative is something different from our own personal vision, no matter how well we frame it. So yes, it is necessary to go beyond technocratic bullet points and describe a better future for all beyond the status quo. But I'm afraid we got a little carried away with our envisioning a better future and lost touch with the grim reality people experience in their everyday lives. A better way would be to ask ourselves what kind of alliance we would like to bring together. In fact, there is a window of opportunity for realignment of social forces right now. Just to give you one example, the coronavirus has exposed the vulnerability of global supply chains. Geopolitical tensions and protectionism are threatening exporters. Hence, export-oriented companies as well as labor unions alike see the necessity to revive the economies of Southern Europe and are willing to sacrifice neoliberal dogma if it's in the way. Bringing such interest groups as well as their political allies into the transformative alliance can shake up the political economy, creating opportunities for progressives we have not seen in decades. Think about the end of austerity, higher wages, European solidarity, better public services, or investment in the Green New Deal. In order to seize such opportunities, progressives need to think again in terms of political economy. We have to understand that all politics emerge from power relations and must aim to change power relations. Finally, to stage successful struggles, we need entry points that translate narratives into actions. We need concrete projects that can make a real difference in people's lives. In this regard, there's lots of homework to be done. So in sum, in order to build stronger alliances, we need to construct narratives more strategically and with a clear view of the political economy and break them down into concrete catalytic projects. If we want to avert the risk and seize the opportunities of this crisis, we need to master this art as fast as we can.
Paul Mason is a journalist, writer and also a filmmaker. In his Fireworks of Idea keynote, he talks to you about the tremendous effects of the 10 years austerity politics in the UK and correspondingly about the great need for investment in welfare. Also, Paul Mason reflects upon the neoliberal right that turns nationalistic and fights a cultural war against the left. We will hear what the centre and the left can do for the moment. Please enjoy the keynote of Paul Mason.
Hi, I'm Paul Mason. I'm speaking to you from London, where I live. We're still really on lockdown, partial lockdown here. That's of course because we've had the worst outbreak of COVID-19 in Europe, because we've had the worst government in Europe. We don't know how bad the economic hit is going to be from this disease. I mean, worldwide. We've got the World Bank saying -7% for the year for the whole developed world. But really, until we know the nature of the pandemic, we won't know the nature of the crisis that follows. And so any attempt to talk about governance and economic policy, we can spell out the direction, but I think we have to keep an open mind about where this is going. The worst case scenarios are a second or third wave of the virus, no vaccine, and then the secondary financial effects, which haven't really happened yet, kick in. And I think what we should think about tonight is that our model for an economic crisis is usually when something big and bad happens at the beginning, like with Lehman Brothers and the global financial crisis in 2008, and even with the Wall Street crash in 1929. And what we then expect is that the financial aftershock is the first thing that happens. This crisis, I have to say, is going to be more like a tsunami. Tsunami isn't a big wave that hits all at once. It's a long wave that takes a long time. And I think that the real economic crisis we're about to see is not the one that we've seen in terms of plummeting GDP, because this can come back. It's about exactly the question of how much damage, how much financial shock, how much does the financial and indeed governmental architecture of the world fall apart. We've seen stresses in the Eurozone, and I hope we can talk about those tonight. In the UK, we have had a huge fiscal stimulus. In early March, before they realised how bad the coronavirus was going to be, the British government predicted a £30 billion deficit for the year. They are now predicting a £350 billion deficit for 2020. That is deficit, not debt. Debt is set to rise from 75% of GDP to 100% of GDP and above. Now, however big that sounds, it was late, it was chaotic and remains chaotic. It's not really taken effect as it should, and it was done unwillingly because the neoliberals who run our government have no model in their head for how you do a fiscal stimulus. Indeed, much of what is being done in secret and informally between the central bank, the Treasury, and large corporations. So our first argument has to be, once the worst of the first wave is over, there can be no return to austerity. I think this is easier to win because in Britain, the poor state of our National Health Service and the social care service, where many elderly people live in privately run, state-funded, very poorly funded elderly care homes, which is where the crisis hit worst in terms of the virus. It's quite obvious to most ordinary people that that our health and social care service was in such a poor state and has coped badly because of 10 years of austerity. The second point is that we need to remember that globally, and certainly in the United Kingdom, the conservative right is at a crossroads. they know they have to do a fiscal stimulus and they have to do extraordinary amounts of monetary easing. So in Britain, 200 billion extra immediately spent on quantitative easing, and an undisclosed overdraft from the government to the central bank. But they also realise that to get out of this, there will be some state ownership, there will be some state-led investment. There will also inevitably be a retreat from globalisation. But I think this raises for the right a new temptation. The British Conservative government of Boris Johnson thought that it was doing Brexit in order to gain tactical freedom in what it expected to be an increasingly globalised world. So it could cut loose from Europe and play a game of deregulation, bending the rules, breaking the rules in a largely free market global economy. But this prospect has disappeared. So now there is a temptation, I mean, as you know, they cannot deliver to the working class people who voted for them last year, the temptation will be to move from simply the Brexit agenda to outright culture war against the left. And with an expanded debt and deficit, and with a central bank that wants to go on buying debt, they have the same weapons that Trump has. Trump has fueled his culture war with a successful economy until coronavirus hit. And I think I see Boris Johnson doing that. So if they go for a new welfare system, there will have to be a strong welfare system. There will have to be a strong form of employment support, as probably about half of the food and retail sector never comes back. The question is, who gets the support? And I think we will see the rise of narratives of exclusion, of course, aimed first of all against illegal migrants, refugees, then aimed at the legal refugees, and at legal migrants rather, people from the European Union, then the British minorities, and then the ever-present victim of scapegoating, which is very poor people whose lives are so chaotic that they seem different to most other people's lives. I think this is a huge danger going forward, that Johnson is ready to stoke up a culture war. The third point I want to make is political and global. All over the world, as I wrote in my book, Clear Bright Future, we are facing a neoliberal right that has turned nationalist, that it wants, and has to create what Hannah Arendt called the temporary alliance of the elite and the mob. And here in the UK, as I say, we've seen that during the recent Black Lives Matter protests. The Johnson came out to defend maintaining the statues of colonialists and racists and slave owners. And by the time you see this, I will be able to update you on the night. There will have been a huge far-right mobilization to defend the statues of the racists against who? Against our black population, who doesn't want them to exist. Now, under Labour's new leader, Keir Starmer, who is basically he is certainly not as left as Corbyn was, but we would call him the soft left, the mildly anti-capitalist left. Under Starmer, the interesting thing is, although, like every government, the British government got a huge boost in popularity from the lockdown, because the nation seemed to want to come together. The interesting thing is that because Starmer has looked competent, because he has made the right calls on what went wrong, both medically and now economically, we have managed to claw back 5 percentage points, the Labour Party, from where we were when we lost the December 2019 election. So we are now on 38%, which is the highest we've been for years. The problem is, despite every disaster, despite every lie, despite standing there shamelessly defending racist statues, Boris Johnson is on 43%. There is a bedrock of support in former imperialist societies where white supremacy has never been properly challenged for this kind of conservatism. Now, I think we need to discuss tonight the following problem. There is a danger of a meltdown in democracy in the United States in the next 6 months. It is so dangerous that this is why Trump's own generals have stepped back from his calls for troops on the streets, for his calls for the suspension of the rule of law. But this doesn't mean Trump has ceased to fantasize about that. His project is an armed crackdown, a culture war, massive voter suppression, and quite possibly he's looking for an excuse to cancel the election. And when we say, well, if he did that, there would be mass protests, look what happened. The American state has, again, we should recognize this analytically, it has an autonomous part of the repressive apparatus in the form of its local police departments. Police department jobs, 100,000 a year plus, are the best paid jobs that an uneducated racist person can get, I'm afraid. And if we do have to support our American brothers and sisters, it is that part of the state apparatus, not the deep state, not the CIA, the FBI, the army. It is that I'm afraid that Trump will try to use. And of course, the judiciary, which he has massively politicized. Now, if that happens, I think we could see a rapid fragmentation of the global order. I mean, we as the left, we have to always think of the best outcome, but we have to be prepared for the worst, because it was our grandfathers and great-grandfathers and mothers' generation that weren't prepared for the worst when democracy turned ugly towards fascism, towards authoritarianism. We know from the experience of the 1920s and the 1930s that the only effective answer to an alliance of the elite and the mob is a temporary alliance of the centre and the left. And in my country, in Britain, I don't think we did enough. We haven't done enough during the Brexit struggle to create that. The centre didn't want an alliance with Labour. Labour was too wedded to a section of workers that supported Brexit. We can't make that mistake again. And I think that however hostile we are on the left to the political centre, however much we must hold them to account for what they did in the 10 years of neoliberal austerity, the fact is right now that they are not the real or the main enemy. To go on obsessing about the differences between Labour and the Liberals in Britain and the Scottish Nationalists, or the left of the Democrats and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in America, is the modern version of the class against class strategy of the KPD in the third period and of the Comintern in the third period. And I'm not a popular person right now on the British left for saying, as Dimitrov said in 1935, the situation has changed. We need to make a temporary, conditional, but strong alliance with everybody who wants to do what? Quite rightly, we as the left have become the champions of the Green New Deal, of the zero carbon transition. But in the short term, and this may be controversial with some of this audience, I hope we can have a discussion. In the short term, even more important is to defend democracy. I want to make an alliance with everyone who wants to defend democracy, the rule of law, and universal human rights. And we don't need to set up kind of showboating kind of semi-fake progressive internationals. We need to take the real organisations, GUE, NGL, European Democratic Left, the Party of European Socialists, and we need at that level to create real alliances. And then from below. Actually, last year, in a brief episode, you will remember it, I hope, when Boris Johnson suspended Parliament, on the streets there was the beginnings of an alliance of the centre and the left. I took part in and indeed led unofficial and indeed illegal demonstrations on which I met Liberal Democrat members of Parliament, members of NGOs, senior intellectuals of the centre, not the left. So it's possible, and we have to build on this. To finish, the only thing we can be certain of is that the new normal is not going to appear in the next 6 months. But we need to have a new model ready, a model of what? Let's not make the mistake that some in the Labour Party and that some in the American Democrat Party made. What we are proposing is not socialism. We want to call ourselves socialists. Some want to call ourselves communist, anti-capitalist, post-capitalist. Fine. The next phase of human society in Europe and Britain and America will be a different form of capitalism. It will be, however, a form of capitalism which has to face the fact that the huge shocks on biosecurity, because these coronaviruses are coming because we have destroyed the environment, the shock and the chaos that is ahead that arises from climate change, and the bankruptcy of an economy being more or less driven simply by borrowing and money creation, means that capitalism is a time-limited entity. The next thing we produce will be a different model of capitalism, but it will have to be transitional and temporary. And I think if we are clear about that and we spell out what the radical alternative is, then we are in the right place. I think back constantly to what happened in my country after the 1929 crash. The Labour leadership in 1929-30, they were the government, and they kept saying, well, there's nothing we can do because capitalism has crashed. In the end, it wasn't them who moved to a new model. Sadly, it was the Conservatives, and unfortunately, it was our proto-fascist leader, Oswald Mosley. They said, the model's finished. Let's move to a different thing. Now, it was a reactionary form of protectionism and economic nationalism. We need to avoid that. But we need to be ahead of the game in designing and discussing, and where we can in power locally, implementing a new economic model, because if we don't do it, the right will implement theirs. So I hope we can discuss some of those points, and thank you once again.